A fourth shot pierced the air, and I knew they had found me. The bounty hunter's blood was still wet on my hands as I tried to load more bullets into the cold army. Three Apache women cowered in the corner of the cabin. This was not their fight, but now it was mine. I hadn't spoken to another living soul in 5 months, except for my horse Soldier in the two graves behind my cabin. That's how I preferred it. After Gettysburg, after Sarah and our unborn son, silence became my only friend. The half-built second room of my cabin stood as testament to dreams that died 3 winters ago when the fever took them both. The night I found the first Apache woman, frost had already begun hardening the ground. I was checking my traps along Pine Creek, carrying nothing but my skinning knife, a lantern, and my trusty yellow boy, the Winchester 66 that had kept me alive through both war and peace. Soldier's breath clouded in the moonlight as we moved between the pines, my eyes scanning for tracks the way the 8th New York Regiment taught me. That's when I saw her. At first, she looked like discarded clothing near the creek bed, until I noticed the shallow rise and fall of breathing. I approached cautiously, yellow boy at the ready. The woman lay curled on her side, dress torn across the chest, bodice split deep enough to expose skin. Blood had soaked through the fabric at her ribs, where she pressed one hand tight. She opened her eyes when my shadow crossed her face. I recognized that look immediately, raw fear, the kind that expects only more pain to follow. I'd seen it on too many battlefields to mistake it. "I'm not here to harm you," I said, my voice cracking from disuse. Her jaw clenched against the pain. The wound at her side wasn't from any arrow or tomahawk. This was a clean knife wound, the kind made by a hunting blade. White man's work. Near her bare, bloodied feet, I spotted something that made my stomach tighten. A cigarette butt, machine-rolled, and the distinctive imprint of military-issue boots. Blackwood, the bastard's calling card. I should have walked away. God knows I'd sworn to mind my own business after burying Sarah. But something in this woman's desperate gaze held me there, like Sarah's eyes had in her final moments, pleading for help I couldn't give. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," I told her, though she couldn't understand the words. When I lifted her, she winced and clutched at my coat, but had no strength to fight. The walk back to the cabin took twice as long with her added weight, the lantern swinging shadows across the path. She watched me the entire time, distrust and exhaustion battling in her expression. Inside my bare cabin, one table, one stove, one bed I never used, and a cot near the door, I laid her on the bed where Sarah had died. The woman tried to pull her torn dress closed, hands shaking as I moved to examine her wound. "I'm fixing it, that's all," I said firmly. I cut the leather carefully around the gash, cleaned it with whiskey and stitched it with the same steady hands that had once patched up Boys in Blue. Each pull of the needle made her flinch, but she remained silent, watching me with eyes dark as gun oil. When I covered her with Sarah's quilt, my fingers accidentally brushed against the side of her breast. She tensed immediately. I withdrew my hand like I touched fire. "You're safe here," I said, taking my rifle and sitting on the floor near the door. "Sleep." She didn't close her eyes right away, studying me from beneath the quilt she held tight across her chest. Eventually, exhaustion won. I kept watch all night, rifle across my lap. Door unbarred for the first time since I dug those graves behind the cabin. Dawn broke with the sound of footsteps outside. I was on my feet in an instant. Yellow boy aimed at the door, finger light on the trigger. When the door creaked open, I found myself facing two more Apache women, one leaning heavily on the other. Their faces bore fresh bruises, their legs streaked with dried mud, and darker marks I recognized as blood. The taller one supported her companion, whose leg bled down to her ankle. Behind me, the woman on the bed whispered something in Apache. Not fear this time, but recognition. The newcomers stared at me with empty eyes. exhaustion and wariness etched into their features. They didn't run. They just waited as if death or mercy would be equally acceptable. I lowered my rifle an inch, not surrendering but offering what little trust I could. "Come in before you fall," I said. They didn't understand the words, but my gesture was clear enough. The taller one guided her injured companion over the threshold. Their steps were uneven, almost dragging. The first woman on the bed watched them with wide eyes, relief and fear mixed in equal measure. They exchanged words in their language, short and clipped, confirming she was alive. I shut the door but didn't bar it. I pointed toward the crate near the stove. "Sit here." I boiled water, cleaned wounds, wrapped bandages. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were spoons scraping tin bowls as they ate the beans I'd heated, and the fire crackling in the stove. Later, the tallest woman gestured toward the north with 2 fingers, then made a cutting motion across her throat. I understood enough. Danger still pursued them. I checked my Winchester and laid out cartridges in neat rows on the table. Whatever had driven these women to my cabin wasn't finished with them. The tallest woman, Talise, I would later learn, watched me load each chamber of my Colt, her eyes missing nothing. When she pointed at the rifle leaning against the wall, then to herself, I understood the question. I hesitated only a moment before retrieving my second rifle from the trunk. I placed it on the table with a box of cartridges, not handing it to her directly, but making my intention clear. Her eyes widened slightly. No white man had ever armed an Apache woman. I didn't need to explain. The way she checked the action, braced the stock against her shoulder. I knew she'd held firearms before. The other women watched with faces that had witnessed men killed. This wasn't their first fight. Later, as night pressed in, I walked the perimeter of my cabin, scanning the tree line for movement. 2 years in the trenches had taught me to sense danger before seeing it. Something in the air felt wrong, like the stillness before artillery fire. Back inside, I found the first woman, Nayeli, sitting up in bed, the shawl I'd given her wrapped tight around her shoulders. Our eyes met, and she pointed to my chest, a question in her gaze. "Jack," I said, tapping my sternum. "Jack Miller." She nodded once, then pressed her palm to her own chest. "Nayeli," she whispered. The others followed, Talise and Kiona. Names gave substance to what was forming between us. Not friendship, not yet, but something more than strangers. That night as they slept, I cleaned my yellow boy by the dying light of the fire, each movement automatic from years of practice. I'd come to Arizona territory to escape memories of the war, only to find another kind of battle had followed me. The next morning, while checking my traps, I found tracks that made my blood run cold. 4 men, heavily armed, moving with purpose toward my cabin. One set of boot prints I recognized instantly. Colonel Wesley Blackwood, formerly of the 7th Virginia Regiment, the butcher of Gettysburg, the man I'd shot through the shoulder but failed to kill. I'd heard rumors he'd turned bounty hunter after the war, but the stories that followed him were darker than any battlefield tale. Not just a hunter, but a collector. The Apache heads he took weren't for bounty alone. They were trophies. Back at the cabin, I found Talise standing watch by the window, my spare rifle ready in her hands. 4 men, I said, holding up fingers, coming this way. I didn't need language to explain what came next. I moved furniture, boarded windows, creating firing positions at each corner of the cabin. Kiona, though still limping, helped pile supplies where they could serve as cover. Nayeli sorted through my medical supplies, preparing for what we all knew was coming. 2 years in the trenches taught me how to turn anything into a fortress, I explained, though they couldn't understand. And how to kill men who think they're untouchable. I showed Talise how to use the rifle's sights properly, correcting her stance with careful hands. Killing a man and shooting accurately are different things. I'm teaching you the second. When Nayeli approached with a poultice of herbs for Kiona's leg, I watched in silence as she applied the mixture with practiced hands. Army surgeons could learn something from her tribe's knowledge. "Where I come from," I said to her, "you might have been a doctor." She didn't understand my words, but she held my gaze longer than before. By midday, supplies were running low. I calculated what we had. Ammunition enough for a fight, but food for only 2 more days. Someone needed to ride to the trading post 10 miles south. "I'll go," I told them, using gestures to make my meaning clear. I pointed to my yellow boy, then to Talise, mimicking guard duty. Talise nodded once, already moving to the window to scan the tree line. Nayeli touched my arm briefly, the first time she'd initiated contact, and spoke soft words I couldn't comprehend. The meaning came through clear enough. Be careful. The ride to Henderson's trading post took 2 hours of constant vigilance, scanning every ridge and draw for signs of Blackwood's men. The small cluster of buildings appeared through the trees like a mirage. 3 wooden structures and a corral, the only civilization for 30 miles. Henderson himself stood behind the counter, a heavy-set man with thinning hair who asked few questions and remembered too much. His eyes narrowed as I entered. "Miller, ain't seen you since winter." I laid my list on the counter without preamble. Coffee, flour, bullets for a Winchester, bandages. He raised an eyebrow at the last item but began gathering supplies. "Heard there was trouble up north. Apache raiding party hit a homestead, but the Army got 'em. Most of 'em anyway." I kept my face neutral. "That right?" Blackwood's hunting the ones that got away, offering bounty." Henderson leaned closer. "3 females, young ones. You seen anything unusual up your way?" My hand rested casually on my Colt. "Just checking my traps, minding my own business." Henderson studied me a moment longer. "Blackwood was in here 2 days ago. Asked about cabins in these parts." A pause. "I might have forgotten to mention yours." My eyes snapped to his. "I don't much care for how he does business," Henderson added quietly. "Man collects scalps like some collect arrowheads. Ain't natural." As I loaded supplies onto Soldier, Henderson followed me out. "Wait a minute. Miller? Jack Miller?" Recognition dawned on his weathered face. "From the 8th New York? The sharpshooter who put a bullet in Colonel Blackwood at Gettysburg?" I secured the last bag without answering. "God almighty," Henderson muttered. "He's been asking about a Union lieutenant who disappeared after the war. That's you, ain't it?" I mounted Soldier, checking my yellow boy before settling it across my lap. "War's been over 10 years, I said flatly. Henderson shook his head. "Not for Blackwood, it ain't. Man's got a memory like carved stone." "So do I." The ride back felt longer, each shadow among the trees a potential threat. When the cabin came into view, relief flooded through me. No smoke, no signs of attack. Talise stood at the window, rifle ready until she recognized me. Inside, I shared what Henderson had told me. "Blackwood," I said, the name like poison on my tongue. "Blackwood's coming, not just for you, for me too." I unpacked the supplies and laid out my plan. We had one advantage. Blackwood didn't know I recognized his tracks. He thought he was hunting unsuspecting prey. I intended to show him the error of that assumption. That night, I worked by lantern light, creating primitive alarms from tin cans and string, setting them at strategic points around the cabin. I dug shallow pits, covering them with brush, not to trap men, but to slow them down, channel them where we wanted. In war, I explained to Talise as we worked, the difference between living and dying isn't usually strength. It's knowing what's coming before the other fellow does. Dawn broke with unnatural stillness. No bird song, no wind in the pines, just silence, heavy as a wool blanket. They were close. I positioned everyone with clear fields of fire. Naily, weakest with firearms but steady-handed, took the shotgun in the rear window. Kiona, legs still wrapped, but moving better, covered the east side with my Colt. Talese, who'd shown a natural talent with the rifle, took the north-facing window. I kept the yellow boy and covered the main approach. Don't shoot until I do, I instructed, demonstrating with gestures. Let them get close. The first sign came as a metallic tinkle, one of my alarm strings. My finger tightened slightly on the trigger as 4 riders emerged from the tree line. 3 I didn't recognize, hard men with empty eyes, the kind that filled the ranks of both armies during the war. The 4th, riding slightly ahead, I knew immediately. Colonel Wesley Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, right arm slightly stiff from where my bullet had shattered his collarbone at Gettysburg. His beard had gone gray, but his eyes remained the same, cold blue, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. At his belt hung what looked like scalps, dried and preserved. "Jack Miller," he called out, voice carrying across the clearing. "I know you're in there, Lieutenant. 10 years is a long hunt, but I'm a patient man." I remained silent, sighting down my barrel at his chest. "I've come for what's mine," Blackwood continued. 3 Apache bitches escaped from justice. Hand them over and perhaps we can discuss our own unfinished business like gentlemen. Finally, I called back. "There are no Apache bitches here, Colonel. Just 4 American citizens who don't take kindly to trespassers." A harsh laugh. "Citizens? Since when do savages and traitors count as citizens?" He shifted in his saddle, scanning the cabin's defenses. "You always did have a weak spot for lost causes, Miller. Got you shot at Antietam, if I recall." "And got you shot at Gettysburg," I replied evenly. "Difference is, I learned from my mistake. I won't aim for your shoulder this time." Blackwood's smile vanished. "Last chance, Lieutenant. The women, or we burn you all out." "One problem with that plan, Colonel." I aligned my sights carefully. "You won't live long enough to light the match." What happened next was pure chaos. I squeezed the trigger, my bullet catching one of Blackwood's men in the chest before he could dismount. Talese fired a split second later, her shot going wide but spooking the horses. Blackwood and his remaining men scattered for cover, returning fire that splintered the window frame inches from my head. For 10 minutes, lead flew in both directions, the sound deafening in the small cabin. One of Blackwood's men made a dash for the north side, only to stumble into my hidden pit. Keona put a bullet in him before he could climb out. "Hold position!" I shouted unnecessarily. The women already settled into a rhythm of cover and fire that would have impressed my old sergeant. A crash from the rear of the cabin. Blackwood's 3rd man had circled behind. The shotgun roared as Nayeli fired, the blast catching him in the shoulder and sending him sprawling backward. Not dead, but no longer a threat. Blackwood himself remained pinned down behind a fallen log, occasionally firing to keep us occupied. I knew what he was waiting for. Nightfall, when the advantage would shift to the attackers. "We need to end this now," I muttered. Catching Talisa's eye, I motioned for her to maintain fire while I slipped toward the rear door. Outside, staying low, I circled through the underbrush, using every trick I'd learned as a scout. 20 years of hunting and soldiering had taught me to move like a ghost when needed. I worked my way behind Blackwood's position, Yellow Boy ready. I was 15 feet away when a twig snapped under my boot. Blackwood spun, firing from the hip. The bullet tore through my left arm, sending white-hot pain up to my shoulder. But momentum carried me forward, tackling him before he could chamber another round. We crashed to the ground, his rifle spinning away as my wounded arm collided with his chest. 10 years I've waited for this, Blackwood snarled, driving a knee into my ribs. The Yankee who couldn't finish the job. He was strong, prison yard strong. But I had rage on my side. We grappled in the dirt, each seeking advantage, his hands closing around my throat as I struggled to bring my knife up between us. "I'll hang your scalp alongside the savages," he growled, spittle flying. My vision began to darken as his thumbs pressed deeper. Then came the sharp crack of a rifle, Talese, firing from the cabin window. The bullet struck Blackwood in the back, causing him to arch in pain and loosen his grip. It was all the opening I needed. I drove my hunting knife upward beneath his ribs, angled toward his heart. His eyes widened in shock, then understanding. "The war," he gasped. "Is over," I finished, twisting the blade. "You lost." When I staggered back to the cabin, arm bleeding freely, I found the women waiting in watchful silence. Niley moved immediately to examine my wound, her hands gentle but firm as she applied pressure. "Blackwood?" Talise asked, one of the few English words she'd learned. "Dead," I replied, watching understanding cross their faces. "It's finished." That night, as Nayeli stitched my arm using the same careful technique I'd used on her, I looked around my cabin, no longer empty, no longer silent. The second room, half built since Sarah's death, suddenly seemed like something worth finishing. Over the following weeks, as spring softened the land, we established a routine. Each morning, Talise would hunt with my spare rifle. Kiona, her leg fully healed, tended the vegetable garden I'd neglected for years. Niley, whose medical skills surpassed anything I'd seen outside an army hospital, gathered herbs and treated whatever ailments arose. I resumed construction on the second room, my hammer echoing across the clearing where once only silence had lived. Sometimes Niley would bring water as I worked, watching the walls rise with something like hope in her eyes. We still lacked a common language, but understanding grew between us nonetheless. At night around the fire, they began teaching me words in Apache, and I returned the favor with English. Friend was the first word we all learned to say in both tongues. One evening as sunset painted the cabin walls golden, Nayeli said my name, Jack, without a trace of fear beneath it. Just my name, spoken by someone who chose to stay. I looked up from cleaning my yellow boy, meeting her steady gaze across the room where once only ghosts had kept me company. "Home," I said, pointing to the cabin's walls, then to each of them in turn. Nayeli nodded, a small smile touching her lips as she repeated the word. Home. The war was finally over. Not just the one with Blackwood, or even the one between blue and gray. The one inside me. The one I'd been losing since I dug those graves behind the cabin. Behind us, the door stayed unbarred, and nobody tried to run.